Okay, thank you for joining us on yet another episode of the Net Podcast. I'm Dave, and I am joined by the usual cohort of co-hosts, the venerable Carl Mestry, Brent Salisbury, and of course Tom Nadeau. And we are joined today by a very special guest, fellow Red Hatter, Lisa Caywood. Lisa, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Dave. So I'm Lisa Caywood. I have been working in open source since I first met Tom Nadeau, actually a bit before that, way back, and Kyle Mestry and Brent and Dave, actually, way back when we were all working on Open Daylight, 10 years ago.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, all three.
Everybody.
All four of us.
Those were the days.
The gang is back together.
Exactly. So I was at Brocade at the time, and then I went and joined the Linux Foundation, who worked on Open Daylight there, and I was there for, 3 years or something like that, and then did a brief tour at Juniper, and now I'm at Red Hat. I've been Red Hat for coming up on 2 years now, so that's been a fun ride.
Nice. It's always great to talk to you.
Miss you guys.
Yeah, it's actually really timely that you're on today, because you and I talked a couple months ago about the open source program office head position that I was creating at Spirent, and I just finished that last night. Thanks for the input, but it's perfect to have this chat about OSPO and how to handle all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's very pertinent to how the five of us actually came together as well. I mean, back 8 or 10 years ago, the telco world was not particularly fluent in open source norms and behaviors, and that was definitely a learning process for the whole industry. We're starting to see that same process happening in other industries now. And it's actually really, really interesting to watch. So my current job at Red Hat is actually focused on a specific set of verticals. So rather than working with a particular project, I work with mostly our internal stakeholders who are focused on a given vertical, and to kind of work with them in relation to all of the different projects within that relate to that industry. So I work with our telco team, but I also work with our team focused on industrial and manufacturing concerns, and we're starting to look at the healthcare vertical as well. And it's the same questions that keep coming up. Well, so what does it mean to do open source? What does it mean if I sign this license? Am I giving away all of my IP to the entire world for eternity? Like, what does all of that mean?
All the usual stereotypes and all of the usual stuff every one of these you have to go through. It's the same questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are
a
few vertical specific ones, but yeah.
And that's what I'm doing right now. What I was saying, like with my role, I've had to chug through this internally and get people on the right page, about this stuff. And sorry to interrupt you there, but maybe one thing you could do is get into the kind of the details of what actually composes that role and what's important in there,
Yeah.
Like what you're describing is a pretty mature situation in terms of an OSPO group, right? At Red Hat, I mean, you guys have a lot of projects you manage and a lot of that. I'm talking about one person starting out, over here on the left-hand side of the whole journey. What should that person think about?
Well, so the first thing, as I was just alluding to, is really kind of internal stuff. It's not engaging with upstream communities or open source communities. It's really about getting the internal ducks in a row. And the first place that usually starts, ironically, has nothing to do with tech. It has to do with the legal department.
Yep. And licensing and all that fun, right?
Yeah, because the first thing that the way you get people's attention is you go, so what's our exposure? What's our legal exposure? Because, every single developer and engineer out there is copying and pasting stuff off the internet, downloading libraries, what have you.
Right.
And not necessarily looking at the licenses involved.
Just throwing it in. I mean, and a good example of that recently is Docker's licensing change, right?
Yep.
For Docker desktop and so on. Now you must pay if you use it in production.
Right. And what does that mean retroactively, right? If you had it in your code in the past.
Yep. And if you're shipping this, if you're shipping Docker Engine in your product and you were shipping it, gratis, now you're not.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of thing that lawyers, once they understand the issue, tend to get very exercised about. Mm-hmm. The challenge then for a new OSPO person is to make it so it's not an onerous burden for the engineers and make it so that all of a sudden they can't do their jobs, right? You kind of have to thread that needle.
Yeah, you remember what the first thing I thought of when you said that was when we were at Brocade. You remember what the whole thing about code has to be reviewed before it can go upstream? That was the whole algorithm or whatever at the time, and how onerous it was on engineers. What do you mean? I gotta have the line I push to Git or wherever has to be reviewed for legal stuff and all that. So you're definitely right. You're touching on a really important area to figure out. Because you can't just insert this giant resistor in the middle of your engineering process, right?
Exactly.
Well, it becomes even more challenging. It becomes more challenging because typically it's not just your company. And I think that's what some of these companies fail to understand. So you could apply the process, like you're saying, on your company, but if you're participating in a community, no one else, other people might not be applying that. And I think they also forget that typically they're either signing like a CLA or they're using the DCO. And in either case, that should cover whatever legal concerns that they have there. So
it's probably worth explaining actually what is CLA and what is DCO. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Kyle?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can do that for sure. So, one of the things that your legal department will likely want to discuss with you is if you have engineers or you yourself are pushing code into a project, what does that mean from a legal perspective? Who owns that code? Who owns the resulting release and some things like this. And so typically the projects will either have something like a CLA, right, a contributor license agreement that you have to sign before your code can be merged into the project, in which case then that CLA that you're signing has a lot of legal language that talks about, who's going to own the resulting intellectual property and things like this. And it's more of a heavyweight process. You'll see larger foundations like Open Daylight or like the OpenStack project. They would use CLAs. A DCO is a much
prescriptive about the CLA too, right? I mean, these are the only licenses we allow in our project.
That's right.
That's another thing too, right?
Oh yeah, that's exactly right. Very prescriptive as well. The DCO is a much lighter weight process, right? It stands for Developer Certificate of Origin as well, and it's typically done by when you look at a commit in Git and you see the signed off by line. That's usually what the DCO is, and there's an agreement that you can find it multiple different places online what the DCO means, but you're essentially pushing your rights to that commit into that project as well, and you're certifying some things which you can read about if you go read about what the Developer Certificate of Origin is.
And for folks listening, this is not unique to open source. If anybody's participated in ITU, ITF, for example, ITF has an explicit agreement where you acknowledge that by contributing a thing, any artifact, whether it's code or documentation, that you specifically, and this originated around intellectual property rights, about how you will agree to license them and handle them and all that. So this is not unique to open source. The open source adds some stuff to this because there's typically more license combos and things like that. But it's not really a new thing, right? It's just kind of a governance thing for the organization.
I think we're kind of skipping over a big chunk here, which is really that we're already talking about what people have to do when they contribute to a community upstream. And for most organizations who are first starting out with an open source program office or an OSPO, that's like very, very far away. What they're really thinking about they're really much more about managing their internal risk from a compliance and licensing standpoint. And then for people who have federal contracts, there are lots of requirements about compliance, demonstrating compliance, and also license disclosure and escalations, right? And that doesn't just hit, people who are officially software companies, right? That hits anybody who's selling any kind of product to the government that happens to have software in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that is starting to hit manufacturing organizations pretty aggressively. And again, this is not something that they always have a lot of experience or sophistication with. So there's that whole sort of legal. What do I even know what's in my code? Have I done the code scans? Have I documented everything that's there? Are all of the licenses being used? Is all of the code being used correctly in accordance with the licenses? Have I documented that? That's a whole body of work, really, just to start out, right? And then the next piece of that, and it can sort of happen in tandem, is training your engineers on what to look for. What do these different licenses mean? And what do you have to be aware of? Are there standards that the organization has? You can use things with this license, but not with this license. Different organizations, depending on their business models and appetite for risk and so forth, may have different rules about what licenses they're willing to allow in their products and whatnot. And so there's this whole kind of like training process and that needs to be rolled out across the engineering organization. That's kind of like the next big tranche of work usually when an OSPO starts up.
And that also includes the legal and business conversation too, right?
Exactly.
That's kind of like when I've had those conversations, rewinding a little bit, you were talking about the first conversations with legal are, we're not giving everything away. That's how I've spun it around and said, wait a minute, let's see what we're actually consuming first.
Exactly.
Before we talk about giving anything away. Let's see where our current liabilities are. And that, what I refer to this as the read-only mode of open source, where you're a consumer basically, but consumption for personal use is different than commercial consumption, right?
Yep, and that's where 80% of organizations will likely stay, right?
Yeah.
And that's completely fine. I mean, that's
completely fine. Yeah.
If you're an author of anything, whether you're an author of a book or a blog or a piece of software, I mean, that's the assumption, right?
Yeah. I remember when we were doing ODL, this was a kind of a fun rewind. We mentioned that the operators. Remember, this is why we started OPNFV, because operators thought they had nothing to contribute, and what we realized was they actually do have a lot to contribute. Test plans, documentation, requirements, docs, designs, all of that stuff. And that's still considered what you just said, Lisa, right? That's in the read-write mode stuff, where there are licensing terms associated with any contribution that's made.
Yep. And then there's the third piece, when they do start joining open source organizations, like consortia, somebody has to manage those relationships, right? They have to manage the business relationship. They have to, if they join at a level that means that they're on a board or something like that, or even on a technical committee. Oftentimes when an OSPO starts up, those relationships already exist. They're just scattered all over the organization, and they're managed more or less well depending on who happens to be involved with them, or that person. So a lot of the time, the company, some department joined an organization, and then the person who was involved with them left the organization, and so
Nobody
they have
knows.
this dormant membership or relationship that nobody's doing anything with, but they're still maybe using the code, and maybe it would actually be really useful to understand what's going on there, because the code's really embedded in your stuff. Centralizing those relationships, at least, it doesn't have to be super heavy-handed, but at least so that there's one person who kind of knows what's going on across all those different organizations, and make sure that that your company, your organization, is getting something out of having those memberships.
Well, that's a good point. Is that a lot of these things, when somebody leaves, the renewal for the org is on autopilot now.
Yep.
And and then potentially, like you just said earlier, they kind of open to different liabilities and things like that, right? Without anybody managing this thing.
Kyle, you look like you're about to say something.
No, I'm not. This discussion is definitely really good though, because it does highlight some of those internal things which are, so oftentimes you find different internal stakeholders have different views of open source in terms of that consumption as well, and what that means, and I think that's one of the hardest parts, right? Is working with all those different groups and their understanding of it. So I think this discussion is really good.
I think not only that, but having worked in places with an OSPO and places without, I have found that in the places without, there's always been something missing, because if you're dealing with open source as an engineer, that training that Lisa alluded to, like, you're expected to take that on for yourself, and it kind of it lands you in this awkward gap between legal and business concerns, and with technical as well. Being able to have somebody that's like super on top of all of those things as an ally is massive. So if you're of the network, you're just a network engineering folk, and you're working with Ansible and other projects, like some of our listener base are, having an OSPO is there to kind of help you with some of this stuff, to get so that you don't need to like take on all of this stuff and have those uncomfortable discussions with legal. One great example, and I think Lisa will appreciate this, is we were using a project which was licensed under the WTFPL, and there was an objection from a customer that we'd produced a license document to say that we were using something, and there was an F in there.
Of course.
And these are very awkward discussions to have, and if your job is full on like writing code, it's sometimes an unwelcome distraction.
Well, yeah, and when your company does not have an OSPO, that often means that your legal team is not particularly well versed in open source things as well, and so they can become a blocker as opposed to a support function and an ally. So the first order of business is making friends with legal, really.
But that's a good point, Dave, you made too. Like it's almost, I was using this analogy the other day about my personal OSPO situation, and saying basically what you're saying is engineers now have to take on, this is a real full-time job, which Lisa will attest to, right? It's not like a thing around the edges thing. It's like this person is responsible for a strategic thing, a budget thing. So it's a real thing. So it's asking an engineer to do this is like saying, well, hey, why don't you randomly manage people on the side, or why don't you randomly file some patents, right? Because,
why did you become a lawyer part-time?
And why don't you become a lawyer?
Right. Just on the side, because you got nothing else to do. I think though, Tom, like there is another piece which is like the tooling is easy. Like and there are tools out there which make it very easy to get visibility into all of your dependencies.
like
But
scanning
there's this
and so on.
right. But then there's this wonderful thing that happens afterwards, which is like, and now what? So like I know all of the
Yeah.
dependencies in the stack, but like, is that good? Is that bad? Am I compliant with the license? Am I not? Are some of these problematic? Are some of
Well,
these
that's
exposing
what happened
IP?
to
And
me is we get, okay, you have this pile of output. Now what are you
uh-huh,
going to do? You know?
right.
Yeah. Is that the engineer's job too to figure that out? No, that's a real, that's a skill and a thing to figure that out, right?
So either you go and hire external counsel that are well versed in open source to help you like litigate some of this stuff and figure out what's what. And there are a few of them out there, but they're in very short supply. Like
Yeah.
finding a good open source lawyer is hard. So I think that definitely having a translation layer in between to work with legal is fantastic. But yes, thank you, Lisa, and all other OSPO people like
And
you
all
for
other
making
OSPO
lives
people.
easier.
That's actually a good point. There are specialized open source lawyers and specialized open source lawyer firms. So if you are in the position of just putting together an OSPO for your company for the first time and your internal legal counsel is not particularly versed in these things, there are outside counsels that you can put them in touch with, have them on retainer so that your legal counsel can talk to them and become more skilled, not be making guesses. And they're an excellent resource, but as Dave said, the field is currently quite small and they are in relatively short supply. So that's just something to be aware of.
Yeah. But do
So
appreciate
Lisa,
that it
so
is
Go ahead.
a critical function.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah,
just
for sure.
internally. We haven't even moved out of external yet, but the other thing is for larger projects. I was going to say too. It's a thing that like folks have tried to cobble together, and my personal experience is having somebody who's dedicated to doing that and knows what they're doing is part of the success of the project. The outside project.
Yeah.
I think Carl, you were going to make a point there.
Oh,
Yeah,
I was
sorry.
gonna ask Lisa. So Lisa, talk about some of the experiences in terms of open source programs offices and engaging with the company. Like what should people look out for in terms of, because I've got to believe, maybe, I mean, obviously we all on this call, we all love open source program offices, but is there any sort of resistance sometimes that you can face from even from the engineers about, wait, who are these people? What are they doing? And, is there things people should look out for?
But also to
It's
add
exactly
to how
that.
not to do it too. That's to kind of
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I liked Tom's phrase earlier of sticking a big resistor in the middle of the process, right? Just like legal teams can be a blocker. I mean, OSPO itself can be a blocker, right? If you jump in too early and say you cannot do this, you cannot do any of this, that you've been doing it all wrong all along, and you have to stop everything now. Well, that's not going to go over very well, and you probably won't be employed for very long. But I mean, it's not necessarily even that black and white, right? There are companies I have worked for that are used to doing things a certain way, and even when they engage in upstream projects and they think they're doing open source, they want to do everything in the same way as they've always done it internally and have a very, classical command and control structure.
Command and control, I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And, navigating those internal impulses, especially with senior leadership, is a very delicate task. It is one that calls for a lot of diplomacy, and you really kind of need to have already developed a lot of trust with senior leadership in order to be able to have those conversations effectively. There's
Yeah.
also just, again,
Yep.
the rank and file folks who, let's say that the company has started a project and then donated it, but the project that started it all is still, being used internally, and it's maybe a commercial project. This is, there are a lot of, quote unquote commercial open source projects, where the open source project is actually downstream from the commercial project as opposed to the other way around. And in that case, there's this very strong temptation in many cases for the company to say, well, we're going to take things this way, so therefore the community is also going to take things this way. Here's our roadmap, community. Now go do the work on it, and then we will suck that back into our commercial project, and we will basically use the community as free labor for our commercial product.
That usually doesn't end very well, right?
It usually doesn't end very well, but that's a really hard impulse to overcome, especially when an entire company has built their entire business model around exactly that, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
and we're seeing more and more of those types of companies, right? I mean, there's a VC firm that is decided they're going to specialize in commercial open source, and it's the idea of building a community around your product is obviously very appealing. It's a built-in fan base and potentially a built-in customer base. But you have to be willing, just like with any human child, to let it grow up and be its own thing, independent of you. Your children are not your clones. Your open source community is not going to be a clone of your commercial product. And it's just going to go on autopilot wherever you decide to take your commercial product. I mean, and that's a hard thing to understand.
Well, and flowing from that too is the "what's in it for me" question for those people that are, as you mentioned, the free labor part. At some point that gets old, and like we talked about this a couple of episodes ago. I think when we were talking to Vinny about this is a problem in open source that the people that are working on stuff, for free or not as part of, a commercial arrangement, often, have a certain motivation for being involved in a project, and having somebody show up in a command and control thing is very offensive,
Well, I think that's slightly different, perhaps, in this case, because in those cases, you've got the big company that's dependent on a library from open source, which is maintained for free, and those guys aren't getting paid. And when big corporations show up and say, fix your stuff because of security vulnerability, like that's jarring. But from the commercializing open source standpoint, I think the bigger threat, and this is something which we talked about, I think even longer ago, is more what the motivation is for anybody to try and do that now, because Amazon are going to run it in the cloud for you, like that. that's gonna be what happens, right? And we've seen licenses appear, like the server-side public license and other licenses that attempt to try and maintain some form of value in keeping everything open source, but unfortunately, that's the direction of a lot of these things. You look at Mongo, you look at Elasticsearch, you look at all of these things. They're now all hosted Amazon services with their own distribution, and it's not to bag on Amazon, other cloud providers do the same thing. Yeah. It's a similar problem. It's very difficult to try and commercialize open source right now.
So Lisa, to take your metaphor of a child growing up, what happens when the child grows up into like a sociopathic monster that is completely
We've never
toxic
seen that
to our
happen.
community? Should the OSPO weigh into those kind of scenarios, or is it?
Yeah, well, I think especially when the community, the child, is closely associated with the core business of the company, that's actually a very critical part of the OSPO's role, right? Because it's really about brand management. Yes, the OSPO wears many hats, right? It's the friend of legal, it's the friend of engineering, it's the friend of marketing, it's the friend of brand, and so like at Red Hat, the people who are involved with CentOS, for example, are, they monitor that community very closely. They monitor it for you know code of conduct violations. They monitor it for just general good behavior in the community, good general open source behavior, and wanting to make sure that the people within the community are behaving, whether they're Red Hat employees or other people, are behaving in a way that's consistent with an open source ethos, so that everybody feels like this is something that they can own and participate in, and it's a level playing field. Everybody gets to have their say, and part of that might also mean, holding back the business people internally who want to, point a finger and tell the community that it has to be one way or another.
Lisa, you're kind of touching on attributes of the OSPO role. Like what does this person usually do? Can you elaborate further? You just mentioned some of that stuff, right? Monitoring the community, statistics gathering potentially. What other things are involved?
Yeah, I mean, so and it kind of depends on the level of maturity of the company and the OSPO with regard to open source, right? I mean, different at different stages of maturity, you're going to need kind of different. The OSPO is going to be needing to do different things. But there are lots of different skill sets that can make a person a good OSPO person. Some folks are they're coders who have gotten tired of having their hands on the keyboards, but they have a lot of deep technical knowledge and they're really good at talking with other developers. That's great, especially in really large projects where it can be, or low-level projects where it can be kind of hard to understand what's going on if you don't have a fairly deep level of technical expertise. But again, when an OSPO is fairly young within a company, I think some of the key traits are really about persuasiveness and diplomacy. I think those are always necessary traits, no matter what stage you're in. But those are probably the most critically important traits early on in an OSPO's life.
Cool. Yeah, those things are really critical. I mean, that, and for me, the other thing is the organizational skills around organizing the different things. Budget, the discussion of should you get involved in this project to begin with, or should we start a project? How should we start a project? These are things like this. I've found a lot of value in having a person around that has that expertise, at their disposal.
Well, and we haven't talked about this yet, but there is sometimes the idea of starting a project or donating code to somewhere that is a skill in and of itself. And oftentimes when people do that, there's sort of an initial conversation with business people about, does this even make sense from a business standpoint? What are we going to get out of it is it just is this a piece of code we don't need, but it might have some value to someone else, so we're going to toss it over the wall? Are we going to put it out there as a goodwill thing to the community to say, hey, look, we contribute to open source? Are we doing it as a strategic thing, like, say, a certain large platform project where we want everybody in the world to start, operating in the same fashion because that happens to align with our larger strategic goals as a company? These are all the different considerations. But once you get past that and you say, okay, we want to donate this code base, there is still a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work still left, right? Yeah.
Right. And there's the legal stuff, but there's also, what happens, and, we saw this early on with some of the telco projects that came in, is they just kind of take the whole code base and go, okay, here you go.
Right.
Have fun. And what is useful to do is, and this is again where OSPO folks often can add a lot of value, is to kind of sit down with the engineers and also the business people and go, okay, so again, let's be really crystal clear about what we're trying to achieve with this donation, and let's carve off pieces of this code that are relevant to that goal. Let's not dump everything, but let's understand what we need to donate and what's really not going to be relevant to the rest of the world.
Well, and that OSPO person often brings the perspective of the community to that discussion, which is not always appreciated. It's, well, yeah. I've got this gift for you guys. Why don't you want it?
Exactly.
Well, and I did a bunch of consulting before my previous gig, where I helped a bunch of companies do this, and I literally had to ask that question, like, what? A, like you just said, why do you want to donate this? And B, does anybody want it?
Yeah. So, I mean, whenever you start a project, it's just like starting a product, right? And you have to think like a product manager. Why is this going to be of interest to anybody in the bigger, broader outside world? What problem is it going to solve for them? How am I going to package it so that it's going to be interesting and attractive to people? And then how am I going to talk about it and talk it up so that people want to participate in it and adopt it and use it, right? Those are all
right. People need to want to use this thing or be part of it, and that's back to the what's in it for me question, right?
Exactly. Well, and so having that experience on the other side of being in a community, being a developer in the community, as well as having sort of a product manager mindset, is really important when you want to go help take a project out into the bigger, broader world. So in some ways, an OSPO person is someone who is kind of ADHD and has run through a lot of different roles in their lives, because you need to have a lot of experience in a lot of different kinds of things.
Yeah,
I think was right, and to Lisa's point, like, it can be very easy to open source stuff. Like the barrier is really low. You just press a button on GitHub and it's done. But it's the what happens afterwards and why, which are very frequently not thought through. This thing's perfect. I'll just let other people look at it, and then suddenly they get upset when people are like, would be better if it happened this way, or it's very easy to view open
Your
source
baby's
as
ugly.
a way
what are you going to do about it?
right. I did it for the clicks on Hacker News, and to be able to put out a press release and say that I donated something into the CNCF sandbox, but which after that it's like, then what? Does anybody actually want this? And could I have done this better? And I think
it's like the tree falling in the woods thing, right? If I donate some open source code and nobody wants it, does anybody care?
Right.
That kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And there's a big proliferation of that. If you look at GitHub, there's a lot of companies that operate out in the open and have code out in the open, but they are the only ones contributing to and using that, which isn't terrible. It's just not open source.
Or they just
right?
prevent people from using it. It's just their way of, our code's there, you can see it. Yeah.
Right. But that community element to me is like the missing piece, right?
The intentional
works
community
better.
element. That's the thing. I think that one of the points I heard Lisa make is the intentional community. At least, what are you trying to build? Have a plan,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the things that, for example, the Linux Foundation looks at when they accept a project is how many people besides the originating company are on board with this. They usually want to see at least 2 or 3 other companies who are on board and signing on and willing to be known as founding members, and that they have resources lined up to help contribute to it. Now, it is often the case that when a project first comes out into the open, 90 somewhat, perhaps 100% of the contributors are from that company. And that's not an inherently bad thing. That's just, that's how it is when something first comes out in the open, because the only people who have expertise with that code base are the people who have been working on it in that company. What you want to see over time is that the percentage of the people from the originating company gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that you have more and more diversity for more and more organizations. So it's important not to judge a project solely on the employers of the people who are contributing to it without also understanding where it is in its life cycle, right? And so if you look at something and say, oh, that's a XYZ company's project, if it's 5 years old, yeah, it's probably an XYZ company's project, and they probably haven't been doing a whole lot to build that intentional community. If it's 6 months old, here's your opportunity to get involved and help diversify the project. And if it looks like an interesting project and it might be useful to you, jump in with both feet and help them spread the word.
And that's a fantastic note, I think, to end on, as we're just running up on time. So, Lisa, I want to thank you again for being in the OSPO and all the OSPO things that you do for us, and also for being our guest today. Any closing thoughts, Lisa? Where can people find you on the socials if they want to learn more about OSPOs?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at RealLisaC. I never looked at LinkedIn, but I suppose you can send me a message there. Also, I'm happy to answer OSPO-type questions if you send an email to lcaywood@redhat.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And one final shout out for our sponsor at T1 Nexus. If you need optics, give them a call. We love these guys.
Great. This has been another episode of the Net Podcast. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.